Well, it's about 3:15, so let's go ahead and get started. To make sure you're in the right room, this is Beyond Cultural Competency. I'm Veronica Montaño-Pilch. I used to be with the National CASA Association. I am now a private consultant. I started off with CASA around 18 years ago. Started off as a local volunteer and then became an executive director of a program and then went on to the National Association. And when I say Beyond Cultural Competency, what I'm meaning in that is that there has been a level in corporate America, in nonprofits, about being cultural competent. And it's, what is that next level? What do you do with that information? Yes, you know about different cultures. Yes, you're exploring your own culture. You're figuring out who you are. But then what is that next step? So here for our 75 minutes that we have is we're going to talk about taking it to the next level. But before we take it to the next level, we need to know a little bit of what we talk about when we say, what is culture? Culture is unique to individuals, but the concept of culture is universal, of course. And all of us have it. A lot of times what I tell people, it's the 3 F's. Food, fabric, and fun. Or F could be for family. So all of us have a culture. And you can't say, well, I don't have a culture. A lot of times in some of the trainings I do, someone might say, I don't have a culture. And I look at them and I say, well, do you engage in any of these activities? They're like, yeah. Well, you have a culture. There's a corporate culture. There's all kinds of different cultures. And one of the things I wanted to do, just as a little introduction, is talk about culture and what my culture is briefly. And one of the things that I have is I'm going to have you engage in an activity where you introduce yourself so we can get to know each other a little bit better, and share a custom is a custom or tradition I had while growing up. And I was out in the hallway and I was talking to someone in the room, Mr. Lopez, he's in the back, and he was saying that there's going to be a festival. In what town do you live in? What parish? Sabwali? Sabwali. And there's going to be a tamale festival. So I asked him, well, how do you make your tamales? Well, since where he's from, it was a Spanish settlement. Where I'm from, Albuquerque, New Mexico, it was a Spanish settlement also. And he told me about his tamales, and they make their tamales the same way I make my tamales. And our custom is every Christmas is a big time for tamales, and so you invite everyone over. And why it's a big time for tamales is that the whole family's around, and to make a tamale isn't an easy thing. You get the masa and you have to put it on these corn husks, and it can't be too thick, it can't be too thin, so everyone's around the room sharing what they're going to do, and then you do that. And these days now I make tamales that are vegetarian, so I put in green chili and cheese. For the vegetarian ones, and for the regular ones, I do pork and red chili. And so you invite everyone over, you do your tamale, you roll them up, and then you have to steam them a certain way. So you buy certain pots, and here in Louisiana I saw pots in one of the stores, but it's for those little creatures. Crawfish. Crawfish, yeah. You eat those little creatures. And you probably love them, huh? So we don't eat those little creatures. What we do as a thing as creature eating is we have, Saturday I'm going to one, is a montanza. Has anyone heard of a montanza? So a montanza is you get a goat, a lamb, some little baby animal, and you dig a hole in your backyard, and then you wrap it up, and then you put some coals around it, and then you cover it, and by the end of the day, then you uncover it, you pull it out, and it's cooked wonderfully, and you invite everyone over, and everyone eats and has a wonderful time. So that's my customer culture. And so what I'd like everyone to do is just pick someone that's next to you. You can do it in twos or trios, and pick a customer tradition you had while growing up, or a customer tradition you had now. And remember the 3 F's. If you can't think of anything, think of something in that mind. I'll give you about 2 or 3 minutes to do that. So how was that? I walked around, I got to hear a couple of great customs. Does anyone want to share one of theirs, or with permission from your partner, one that you heard that you thought was interesting? Go ahead.
We had a rite of passage. I grew up at a small pig farm in southern Alabama, and our rite of passage was that once you became 12, almost 13, if you thought you were cool enough and had worked on the farm enough, you were able to chew tobacco. They would teach you how to spit it. So we're riding on the back of the truck. I think today's my day. My cousin gives it to me, and I chew it, and he's trying to tell me how to spit it. Well, as I'm trying to form my mouth to do the spit, we hit a bump, and I swallowed it. So I threw up for like 3 days straight, but that was the cultural rite of passage for us. No, I never touched it after that.
That was the rite of passage, is not to touch it. Great. Anyone else? We'll take one or two more.
Well, we were just talking, we started out talking about how important Christmas was to both of our families, but we kind of had a segue into Saints world. And it's funny how traditions have established. My family's always been a supporter of the football team, but the entire community, the world stops when the Saints are playing now.
Oh, see, I didn't know what you meant. When you said Saints, I was thinking of the Virgin of Guadalupe. I was thinking of the Major. I was thinking about these Saints. See, I'm not from here.
Right. And it's just been, this last year or two has been such a whirlwind. They've looked to see that crime stops when the Saints are on.
Oh, wow.
That the world is kind of on pause. But, you go to a store, you better be out of there by 11:30 in the greater New Orleans area, because it's nobody on the highway, nothing. And so it's become a tradition. Like the other week, my kids said, I think I'm going to make a cake for the Saints game. It's like
it's a big thing.
It's becoming a parallel to Christmas almost, but it happens a lot more often.
16 times.
Oh, look, she knows exactly how many times. 16 times is how often. Okay, so it's a whole culture around watching football.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Adding to that, our family started doing fantasy football, and we're mostly women in the family who we weren't really into it. There's really only 2 guy cousins or whatever, but now all of us are into it. We all have our own teams, and we get together every weekend and we watch the games together.
So,
it's become a family thing.
Do people know what fantasy football is?
Oh yeah.
So, okay. Most people do. So fantasy football is...
Well, we have like a big draft party, so it's like we're drafting our own football team.
Okay.
So you get to pick like different positions and things like that, and then you enter them into whatever, I guess, program you're using, and then it counts it for you as each game plays, and you could take players.
So you're on the computer, so this is high tech. You're not... Okay. Oh, cool.
It's such that like
It's the real deal, yeah.
Like our family, it's so true, because Grandpa has a team and grandchildren have teams, and it's become a culture.
Right.
Because they're talking. My dad was in the hospital, and he was really. I need to talk to Wyatt right now. I need to talk to my grandson right now. I'm like, what do you need? He's like, he needs to get my line up. It's true.
You have to be playing it. Well, hey, it's a way it brings everyone closer together. You said all the women in your family are now doing it with a couple of the men, but it's bringing you together on a different level, right? And I'm sure you have food around it, and you have fabric around it. You wear your do you make teams? Do you make a jersey for your team?
I do have one very corny cousin who likes to make a shirt.
There you go. There you go. So the culture, see, getting into that piece of culture. So thank you very much for sharing. I wanted to talk about that culture and how we see it in our organizations. And this is something that happens quite often, is being in a culture minority does not in itself make a person culturally competent. In so many organizations, someone says, oh, we have to have some cultural outreach. And they look for the minority. They look for the Hispanic. They look for the African American. They look for the Native American. And they say, well, by golly, you should know everything about this. Look at you. That doesn't mean anything, really, when you're looking at that. Again, I'm using Mr. Lopez. He talked about identifying himself as Spanish, and I identify myself as being Hispanic, but my mom identifies herself as being Spanish. If you called her Mexican, she would probably hit you. And then you kind of go through that piece of all her prejudice that come along with it, okay, which are real, which are there. And just because she's Hispanic, you can't think, I mean, she's Spanish, whew, see, she wasn't here, is that whole idea of culture, and that people want you to represent, and you can't represent for your whole group. And so as you become cultural competent, also knowing that when you're seeking to find out new about other people. The second one is becoming culturally competent is not only learning about other cultures, but about your own. I mean, some people find out about another culture, but they don't really explore their own culture. And what is that? My name being Montaño Pilch, my husband is second generation Polish-Italian. And he didn't really know anything about his history. I'm the one who found his grandparents on the sheet from Ellis Island as they came over, the manifest and all this information. And it wasn't until he met me and saw this rich culture that we were in that he finally stopped and said, hey, what about me? Because what happened in our family was everyone sitting around the dinner table. I don't know if this has happened to any of you. You start to talk, and my brothers and sisters would talk about the white man and totally ignore that he was white. And he got angry after a while and said, I'm white, I'm sitting here, you can stop it already. So that really forced him to look at who he was and identify what that meant to him. What did white mean to him? He never ever looked at that until I forced him to really stop and look at that. And so that's that piece of learning about your own culture. Cultural competency does not mean treating all members of a culturally group the same, okay? And this morning I did working with Latino families, and I talked a lot extensively about how Hispanics, Latinos, there's just such a wide range of who we are, and we're lumped together in this one Hispanic Latino mix, and you don't know. And so there's a danger in finding out about, maybe you just find out about Mexicans and assuming that's the way Cubans are or Puerto Ricans are. You can't do that. Cultural competency is the skill of utilizing knowledge of a group and integrating it with an understanding of the individual client, who you're going to be working with. So you may do all this stuff around cultural competency, and then you're thinking, yeah, I'm going to go out to this family and work with them on this issue, and you're assuming all these things, and they have no idea what you're talking about, right? So it's also making sure that for each person you alter that also. The cultural competency is necessary in all client encounters because everyone has a cultural identity, and cultural competency must apply to everyone. So that's what we miss so often, right? We think maybe Hispanic, Latino, Vietnamese, Korean, they have a culture, but you're not thinking about all the other cultures. There's African American, white, and then how does that play into it depending on where you are? When I was in Florida doing this training, I said African American, and a woman stopped and said, well, wait a minute. You're assuming that all of us in the room, because if we're black or African American, I'm a black from Haiti, so don't call me African American. So it's all those little pieces where you just, sometimes you assume too much. And then if someone calls you on it, then you know how to change that. Culture is not just race and ethnicity. I think this is one of the most important ones because groups such as the homeless, poor, foster youth, sometimes one type of culture, whatever it is, if you're in the foster youth population, that may take precedence over anything else. That's your whole life, right? And you may, being Hispanic, African American, yes, it's your everyday who you wake up, but it's also a different culture, which is the culture of being in foster care. So when I say going beyond cultural competency, why are we doing this training, right? Yeah, that's great. You know, I'm not actually ready to sing Kumbaya. I want to know who you are. You want to know who I am. This is so real right now because in child welfare for African American children, they're only 15% of the nation's children, but 36% of the children in care. I mean, we should all be pissed, okay? I mean, this isn't right. If you look at the Hispanic statistics for Hispanic Latino families, in the literature it says that Hispanic Latinos are not overrepresented. Okay? And then there'll be a little asterisk, and then you go down to the bottom, and it'll say in pockets. Look at in different spots in the country they are overrepresented. Native Americans and African Americans are the largest group that are overrepresented in the foster care system. So the piece about just learning about cultural isn't enough. Okay, yes, it's important, but then what are you going to do about it? How are you going to change your systems? Because this is unacceptable. These numbers are just unacceptable. And I didn't pull up the numbers for Louisiana, but I'm sure you fall into the same type of statistics that are occurring across the nation. So what? What can you do? You could blank out the information, which is closed-mindedness, and you could not think about it, right? You're working. Okay, let's say you're a social worker. You have 27 cases. That's probably too low, huh? You have 50 cases. And you have so many things to do. How are you supposed to pay attention to all this other stuff? You're a CASA volunteer. Well, you're only a CASA volunteer. What are you supposed to be doing? How are you supposed to be paying attention to everything? Are you supposed to know everything? Yeah, you are. You need to entertain the idea. We need to change our mindset. Aristotle challenged his students to entertain new ideas, not requiring them to accept or believe them. So that's when we talk about disproportionality and we get beyond cultural competency and we talk about the disparities, then you're starting to talk about big things that people are afraid of, right? Institutional racism, bias, prejudice. Then you're starting to talk about some issues that people don't want to really talk about. And you have to not, if we get away from blaming someone and we say, well, we don't have to prove it, that all of these exist, we need to look at it and change it. So we have to recognize disproportionality. It doesn't require us to question the motives of others. It doesn't, in certain trainings, there's something called, actually it's out of New Orleans, the People's Institute. Have any of you been through Undoing Racism? Okay, in Undoing Racism, there is a point where they say that only white people are racist. And a lot of times in that training, white people get up and walk away. So what this is saying is you don't have to hit people over the head, okay? In order to talk about disproportionality and racism, I don't have to make any sweeping statements that all white people are the ones who started this, or all Spanish people in the Southwest raped and pillaged all the Native Americans, and this is where we are. I don't have to say any of that. All I have to do is talk about what the facts are, and let's work on changing what the facts are. Doesn't require us to question our own motives. Doesn't require us to question our own motives. Because all of us have done things in our career or in our life that we've, after the fact, thought, oh crap, did I really say that? Or did I do that? Okay? This one, we need to go beyond that. That is really open-mindedness. So we really want to look at reducing overrepresentation. So what does that mean? Reduce overrepresentation. What is occurring in the system? Well, we have to identify those decision points. If you're a CASA volunteer, you might not come into the case until after adjudication. I'm not sure of the laws here, but is it adjudication? Okay, so you're not coming in until after adjudication. Depending on who you are as a social worker, you might be an investigative social worker, or you might come down further down the line, right? So what's occurring at each decision point? And then what are the factors involved at each decision point? And then is it a necessary factor? We need to stop and really question each of those decisions, because so often we're like, oh yeah, that's the decision. Let me give you an example of what I'm talking about. In New Mexico, we have a shortage of native foster parents. Okay, what are the factors to be considered? The child abuse registry. Let's say you did a recruitment, you went out there, you got all these Native Americans that want to be foster parents, and it turns out that Nota Begay is on the child abuse registry. Uh-oh. The disparity is that there's not enough Native American foster parents, but if Nota Begay is on the child abuse registry, it matters. You can't change that, right? You're not going to approve him to be a foster parent. Let's say there's a lack of complete paperwork. Is there disparity? Again, not enough foster parents. Does it matter? Yeah, your paperwork has to be complete. We do live in a bureaucracy that we have to fill out certain forms, but we can help change that. So you can change that. You just don't have to say, nope, they can't be a foster parent. Partial change, you help with the paperwork. Now, this is a big one that I'm sure some of you have really seen happen, is that in a foster home, you have to have a bed. Are there rules here in Louisiana? Okay, New Mexico, we have the same thing. But in a lot of Native American homes, there may not be bed frames. It's traditional to have your bed and it lays on the floor, okay? There is disparity because there's not enough Native foster parents. It doesn't matter. Does it really matter if there's a frame? It doesn't matter. So change it. So what I'm trying to illustrate with this is that in everyday small decisions, it might be a small decision, no bed frames, is you can make a difference. And that's where we have to stop, is to really look back at what those small decisions are. Example 2 is detention of juveniles. And I didn't realize my picture when I picked it that he's young. And I thought, oh, that's a little too young. But one of the factors yeah, that's true, is factors considered. I want to go on to this one about not in school. I mean, that's a big one. Have you ever been in a hearing, a juvenile hearing, and they're saying, well, have you gone to school? Have you done this? Have you done that? Does it really matter? What if that child is full-time employed? Okay, what are we asking people to do? And when you're looking at disparities and disproportionality, it's really going back to all those decisions, and does it matter? How can you make it not matter so you can get what you need done for that child, right? I mean, it's the same in child welfare. When you ask a parent may come into care for maybe neglect, and you're then asking the parent, you raise the bar for the parent, and the parent has to now go into anger management. They have to get a job. They have to have a place to live. You never took the child because they did not have a job, right? The child was removed from home maybe for some other neglect reason, but it wasn't because they didn't have a job. So it's all of those pieces of what are we asking our families to do once they're in care. This makes sense, and for me, it makes sense and it sounds easy, but then you get to that point of what are we really doing to change it? Before we go on to our next activity, I wanted to stop here for a moment and talk about racial bias. I mentioned it a little earlier while I talked about racism. There's a couple of things happening. Explicit bias is a conscious preference, positive or negative, for a social category, or implicit bias is a preference, positive or negative, for a social category that operates outside of awareness. So there's two different things going on here. And so there's decisions you may make that you don't even think of that you're making them anymore. Okay, and for me, at our home, whenever I did anything, like I hired someone to cut the trees or do something, one day my husband was like, why do you only hire Hispanics? And I said, well, my smart ass answer was because I'm Hispanic and they make good workers. And he goes, no. My people know how to mow a lawn too, And I was having this conversation with him and thinking on doing this training in my high horse I got on, that I was only going to hire minorities. And he said, well, you're ignoring me. You're totally ignoring me and negating all of this. You're in an interracial marriage, or your children are, but you're only focusing on you. I'm only focusing on that my kids are Hispanic, not that my kids can choose what they want, who they want to be. And because I started doing all this work, I forgot about my explicit and implicit bias that I grew up with and who made me me. And he helps me stop and go, wait a minute, let me think about what I'm doing here in life. That's just in my family life, okay? Imagine how we are in work. I mean, a lot of times you don't have those people stopping you and loving you and having those courageous conversations with you. And as we get into this work, we really need to stop and have those courageous conversations with each other. And just because if you're a minority and you're doing this work, that doesn't mean that you don't have any implicit or explicit bias, so you don't have any stereotypes or prejudices. And we have to be aware of that. Moving a case through the courts and allied systems involves a lot of decision makers, right? I know when I first started off as a CASA volunteer, you get into it so late in the game, sometimes you're like, well, I have nothing to do with that. A lot of CASA programs, when I stop to talk about disproportionality, they say, we have nothing to do with pulling the child. We didn't start that off. And I say, okay, let's talk about disparity. Once the child's in the system, you have a lot of power to raise your voice. That's what you're supposed to be doing. You're supposed to be raising your hand and saying, look, something might be wrong with this. So how much attention is this getting? Okay, it's getting a lot of attention. Here in Louisiana, Louisiana CASA just created a task force. I don't think anyone, they don't call it a diversity task force, but they have a task force that is now looking at this more in depth. Well, NCJFCJ, the National Council of Juvenile and Family Court Judges, is also looking at this. And when I say this about disproportionality and disparity, is they've created a bench book. Great. Thank you. Thank you. Is the National Council of Juvenile and Family Court Judges have a program called Catalyzing Change. And they talk about what they can do to change things in the system. If you look on the left-hand side of this handout, it's called Reflections on the Decision-Making Process that Protect Against Institutional Bias. And what this is just a small section of what the NCJFCJ model court judges are using. Okay, so they recognize that there is implicit bias in the system and they want to do something about it and they want to change it. So this is where they're looking at getting beyond cultural competency. In order for these model court judges to use this bench book, they have to go through an implicit bias training. So what I did is I took this information, I got Texas and Louisiana, the CASA program, social workers out in Texas, we looked at this and then we created this little box here. Because when we looked at the yellow side, we said a couple things are missing. And what was missing on it is the activity that you're going to do next, which is this. I would like you to form groups of 4 to 5 and read the handout and answer one of the questions that speaks to you about a case you have. Okay, so get in groups of 3 to 4 and first read what's on the left-hand side, which is I was going to say the yellow box, but you don't have it in yellow. And then see if there's, as you're looking at it and you think, oh my goodness, I could have thought of that in a certain case. And then look at this other part that says, what can you influence? And when we get back in the larger group, I want people to share something from their group on what they think they can influence and how they could use this one-sheeter. So everyone got it, right? Okay. So I hope there was a lot of good discussion around this. Good. You're like, well, it was good discussion. I was in a group and I went to the back and I talked with Karen. When I first went to Karen, I said, well, did you see any of this that really spoke to you? And then she said where she sits, she doesn't work on cases, but we ended up having a great conversation and I wanted her to share a couple of things because this is exactly what I'm talking about, what she's going to talk about. Because one of the things I asked her was, what about family group decision making? And she told me about what's occurring in Louisiana with family group decision making. But could you share what you had talked about you felt that where you sat, what didn't pertain to you?
Yeah, the work I do in family services does require some periodic review of cases, CPI cases where the decision is to bring the child into care. And sometimes when we're reviewing those records, it's difficult to tell why, how did we make the decision to come to a removal? And it's not always clear that we did all the things we could have done or could have done to prevent the removal. And that includes looking at extended family and looking at other services that could be implemented. We did talk about family group decision making, and that was piloted in Louisiana up until shortly after Katrina. We had 3 pilot sites, and we just did that on a very limited scale, though, and very few cases were able to be referred, and there were some difficulties with implementation of the model, and so we just were never really able to infuse it into the agency as a really a practice model and a philosophy that we could adopt, and that would be a mechanism for getting more, I guess, more reasoned or more thoughtful processes in place, and it would be a good model for the CPI level of case, even to look for alternative outcomes or processes for those cases. Some of the cases that I've looked at are cases that were served in the Family Services Unit, and then children ended up coming into foster care. And it seems like the other piece that's missing is that we have such, a lot of staff that are frontline field staff are new and they don't have a lot of experience. And in some areas, the supervisors don't have a huge amount of experience either. And so sometimes the way that the families are assessed and the needs that are, some of the needs are not really being identified, so the right services aren't put in place. And so we still end up removing children when we may have been able to keep them in the home if we had been able to do a more thorough look at that. And I think the only other thing I kind of thought about was the issue of, I think we still have some perspective about rescuing children rather than focusing on meeting the needs of children, and kind of a sense of rescue may promote the idea of removing the children from the environment more than trying to improve the environment.
Okay. Thanks, Karen. And so that's that one question that she saw on here, which was, have I recommended place a child in foster care as a last resort? So this section is for judges and their bench books, but if you go to the NCJ, FCJ website, Courts Catalyzing Change, they have this there. And Louisiana CASA will have this on their website also that you could use in your offices. But one of the things that I looked at there when she was talking about it is using it as a last resort. And that's why I asked her, was there family group decision making here? And she had said no. And I said, so is anyone looking at fictive kinship, any of those issues immediately? And so it's that piece of really stopping and saying, what are we doing? Can we do something else? How do we reduce disproportionality and disparity? It's such a big thing that sits over here, but if you take it down to this level of what have I done, what assumptions and value judgments have I made, or if you take it down to answering these questions. Is there someone else in your group that you want to share? I know a couple of groups were talking about a lot of stuff as I walked around from behind you. Is there one more before we start to wrap it up? Did anyone see how they could use this in their offices? Maybe, and you really start to get the conversation going. One of the other things that you could do is let's turn over, which is, can you be the change? If you turn your sheet over, it says, what can you do to help eliminate disparities? Okay? Is research. People want you to prove it. So Karen had said that DCF, is it DC? DCFS. DCFS. Done a lot of research recently on the numbers on disproportionality. So is it at your website to get all the numbers on? Nope. Okay. But what this talks about is, what can you do? Is data does drive the work. Is when you're working with your supervisors, when you're working with judges, getting people together. I know there are certain task forces that are starting to occur across the state. Is know your numbers. And the other piece here is training and education. Know yourself. You're right here in New Orleans. I mean, not too far, 3 hours away, right? There is the People's Institute. There is Undoing Racism. There's a lot of training here in Louisiana. The YWCA also has training. Is enroll in some of that training. And then build collaborations. You can't do this alone. I think we have to really start working together. So often, CASA and social workers have sometimes been like this. And you have to really recognize that and say, no, we need to work together. Okay, it's not about you over here rescuing the children and then me rescuing the children over here. All of us have to work together in order to change something. And then join a task force. And if you don't have a task force in your area, create one. You be the change. Take action. Look at the take action piece. And before you walk away today, I want you to identify one way. It's the second bullet. Under take action, it says identify one way you feel you can impact disparities in your own work. So before you actually walk away, stop for a minute and think, what can you do? Is it going to be something in training? Are you going to go back and write another report and say, or ask your supervisor and say, we need to send another report to the judge. This is unacceptable behavior. I need to document a little bit more. What are you going to do to really change things? And identify the gaps in services and start working closer together, and then share what you learn. Be the voice that gets the conversation started. So this piece of paper is meant for you, both of them. This one is meant for you to use. A lot of CASA programs in Texas, they're the ones I've been doing most of the work with, is they now, for new volunteers, they've laminated this and they give it to their volunteers. One program put 3 hole punches, laminated, and told them that they have to look at this. And then in Texas, in almost a lot of their counties all have task force. So they use these to begin their task forces to look at disproportionality and disparity. And if you go to the Texas DFPS website, they have made a difference in disproportionality and disparity. But they also do family group decision making. They look at fictive kin. The CASA program and the social workers are really working close together. So it's all about collaboration, creating relationships, and working together. So that my 75 minutes is up. So if you have any questions, if not, this is who I am, and you could always email me, and I'll send you the copies of this so you could print them in color, because it's nice to have them in color. So thank you.